Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled The Water Food Nexus in Mountain Systems, hosted jointly by the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska and one CGIAR through the International Potato Center's Andean initiative. This webinar today will take a close look at a few issues at the nexus of water resources in agriculture in the two largest mountain chains in the world, the Andes and the Himalayas. Before we go on, we want to be sure to include everyone, so please access the translation from English to Spanish if needed. You can access this by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom controls and selecting the Spanish option. Special thanks to our translator, Maria Nelly Cuculiza, for making this possible. If you'd like to listen in English, just stay on this main audio channel as all our speakers today will present in English. I'm Dr. Randall Ritsema, Research Program Scientist here at the Water for Food Institute, and I have the pleasure of serving as today's moderator, along with Dr. Steph Dahan, Senior Researcher, Andean Food Systems, and Coordinator of the International Potato Center's Andean Initiative. We are pleased to have had a lot of interest in today's topic and more than 290 people registered for this event. And as an attendee, your video and audio will be paused, but we invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself with your name, position, organization, and country. Please also contact us in the chat box with any technical issues you're having. After the presentations from our three speakers, we will have time at the end for questions. So please add your questions for our speakers at any time in the Q&A box, also located at the bottom of your Zoom controls. You can ask questions in English or Spanish. We will try to address as many audience questions as possible in the time that we have. The recording of this webinar in both English and Spanish will be posted to DWFI's YouTube channel, and you will receive the link via email when it is available. Before we hear from our three speakers, I would like to invite directors from our two hosting institutions to give some brief opening remarks. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Oscar Ortiz, Senior Director, Crop-Based Systems at one CGIAR. Dr. Ortiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to participate today in this webinar, which is an example of interactions and collaboration and the nexus that should occur among multiple organizations to address the challenges that we have in relationship to water. Particularly when talking about mountain systems, which are not that visible in the global debates. So today's webinar connects two very important mountain systems, the Andes and the Himalayas, to share experiences. And of course, we know that the challenges related to water are coming very soon, and all multiple modeling are predicting scarcity getting more and more acute in the coming years. And that affects particularly mountain systems in the Andes of South America, the mountains of Africa, East Africa, and of course, Asia. What we need to address is to have a systems view that connects all the way from the microsystem, the crops, the relationship between crops and water, all the way up to the regional and macro systems where multiple policies and organizations participate in decision-making. At the CGIAR level, we are working in three global science groups. One of them is called Systems Transformation, which is addressing the macro level solutions, particularly policies, aspects, policies and markets, where water challenges are included in those discussions. We have also the other global science group called Genetic Innovation Science Group, where new crop varieties are developed, and there enhancing water use efficiency and drought tolerance are a critical trait for the future. We need to have crops that are more tolerant to drought and water scarcity. And we have another global science group, which is called Resilient Agri-Food Systems, which is dealing with field, farm, and landscape management, where irrigation innovations for small-scale waters are developed and included. So we need to support farmer decision-making to use water more efficiently, particularly smallholder farmers. So just a few remarks to close my opening words. Water connects us all, from plants to countries and regions. Small-scale farmers produce most of the food we eat in developing countries, and we need to support their decision-making, not only at farm level, but at levels, policy levels and investor level, to be able to support research and development activities. So we need to connect research, education, extension services, development services, private sector to address these complex challenges. Thank you very much for your attention, and all the best for the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for providing that important backdrop on 1CGIAR and water resources. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter McCormick, Executive Director of the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute, to convey some of his thoughts. Dr. McCormick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you, Oscar, for that great overview. I'm very, like everyone else, I'm excited to be holding this webinar, and welcome all to this webinar on the Water Food Nexus in Mountain Systems. Thank you for joining. I appreciate, I'm looking through the chat and seeing we've even got folks coming in from Nepal. So thank you for staying up so late to participate. I'm Peter McCormick. I'm the Executive Director of the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska. At DWFI, we collaborate with our partners within the university system across the state of Nebraska, and then in key water and food landscapes around the world to develop and apply solutions towards our vision of a water and food secure world. So this webinar is especially relevant to our vision and mission, but it's also very relevant to how can we engage with this particular part of these particular challenges. And in these mountain landscapes, of course, it's the rate of change it tends to be faster, and the challenges of course are different. But as we talk to our partners in the Himalayas, but then also in the Andes, we recognize there's opportunities and synergies there to share knowledge across these, but also work with some of the tools and techniques that have been developed elsewhere to address these issues. So partners are key, and this is very much from our vision of being global and being engaged, but also to achieving impact. There are important principles associated with this complex space that we need to apply, and Oscar mentioned a number of those, but each water and food context is quite unique, and as to achieve impact, we're really it's very important to have partners from those contexts to try and address the issues in the local situation. So engagement with those partners, but also their network of partners. And again, I see from the people in the chat box, we have people from a very diverse group of partners from around the world. I would just like to thank the 1CGIAR and for engaging in this. Oscar and I have we've been having this conversation with the International Potato Center and with the 1CGIAR around engaging in some of these challenges. We also have the International Water Management Institute joining us here today, but again, other partners that we can work with to really, over the long term, have impact where we're focusing. maybe just as a bit of a background, we don't have any mountains in Nebraska specifically, but our surface water resources here are primarily snow driven. We've got a lot of snow lying on the ground this week, but we see a lot of the larger sort of basin scale impacts of what is happening as the snow melts at different times and some of the challenges associated with that. We are engaged in the Himalayas and to a lesser extent in the Andes, but we certainly want to be more involved in these important landscapes. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Randall. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for connecting, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of today, Bert de Liebre. He is currently the technical secretary of FONAG, Quito's water fund, and Bert has more than 30 years of experience working in the tropical Andes. He has worked in academia at the University of Cuenca in Ecuador, and subsequently also worked for over a decade on projects in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, focused on Andean ecosystems such as the Paramo system, which he will also talk about more today. Based out of Condesán in Lima, he advised Peruvian authorities for several years on water issues. And since October 2015, he leads the FONAG in Quito in the fulfillment of its mission of conserving and restoring the source water areas for Ecuador's high-altitude capital, Quito. Bert holds a PhD in applied biological sciences and an MSc in water resource engineering. So, Bert, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you to the International Potato Center and the University of Nebraska for this for the invitation to share today on this topic, water food nexus, or in our case here, I think we can also talk about a water agricultural conflict, in high altitude areas as the ones surrounding the city of Quito and applicable to most of the high altitude areas in Ecuador and the tropical Andes in general. I will focus a bit on the Paramo ecosystem, which might sound like very specific for Ecuador, Colombia, where most of the paramos are located. But anyway, I think there are many things are relevant for other high altitude areas in the world. For our global listeners, a little bit of introduction on the location. So we are in Ecuador. The capital of Ecuador, Quito, is located in the northern central part, where we are surrounded by Western Cordillera of the Andes and the Eastern Cordillera of the Andes, 2.5 million inhabitants at a altitude range of 2,700 to 3,400 meters above sea level, and dependent on the water that we can obtain from the even higher altitude areas around the city, both at the western, at the eastern side that separates us from the Amazonia. These areas are of course cultivated to a large extent. The agricultural frontier is climbing up the mountains into this special ecosystem of Paramo. What's the Paramo? And actually, there is no English translation, because most of Paramos are located in the Andes. Although there are very similar ecosystems in high altitude tropical areas in Africa, around Kilimanjaro, for example, and a little bit also in Papua New Guinea. Because to be a Paramo, it needs to be sufficiently high, and it needs to be tropical, sufficiently close to the equator. No, further south, in the case of the Andes, we have similar ecosystems in Peru, Bolivia, called Puna. No, but those are already prone to seasonal variations. While in Paramo, being on the equator, we don't have any seasonal temperature variation. We do have huge daily temperature variation, which is one of the main characteristics. The other one, and more important, maybe for the water, for its role as a water source, is its deep organic soils, no? At least around Quito, very deep, no? Because they are around Quito completely volcanic. We have active volcanic systems here, and can have soils developed on that of several meters deep, even peat of several dozens of meters deep, no? So it's above the tree line. To be a Paramo, it needs to be above the tree line. It's not a forest. It's rangeland, shrubland, pasture, above the tree line, no closed forest there, and sufficiently close to the equator. That gives way to the development of the special characteristics of low evapotranspiration and very high water regulation capacity, especially in its soils. It's not that it rains that the rainfall is extremely high. It's rather about the water regulation capacity, which is extraordinary, even though all of these areas are on high slopes. They're relatively small extent of flat areas. And in spite of that, we have a very good water regulation capacity on these sloping soils. What are the threats? And with a certain focus on agriculture here, but before that, we can all say that even urbanization, is a threat. Actually, the highest areas of the city of Quito, are now reaching the Paramo altitude limit. All of the forest below that has already been eliminated, and the city itself is expanding into the Paramo, and eliminating, we could say, eliminating its own water sources. But historically, and in other places where it's not that highly urbanized, agriculture and livestock farming are the most important threats. With different types of disruptions. The less worse ones are probably livestock farming related to with burning, associated with burning to obtain pasture growth. As long as this affects only the vegetation cover and not really goes into the soil, the effect is relatively seen smaller and more temporal. The worst thing to happen for the water regulation capacity of a Paramo is when the soil is affected. The extremely fragile structure, extremely porous structure of these mainly andosols and histosols, volcanic or not, here in Quito volcanic, with a huge capacity of water retention to up to more than 80–90% water retention capacity. And when these soils are affected, for example, by cultivation or compaction, of course, this extremely fragile structure disappears, and therefore disappears its water regulation capacity. Also related to climate change, we talk a lot in the Andes about the glacier and ice and snow water regulation capacity in these areas, but actually most of the water regulation capacity at high altitude in the Andes is in this kind of ecosystem and in its soils. In the case of Quito, we obtain only 2% of our water from glaciers. This might vary further south in Peru and Bolivia. There are certainly areas with higher percentages, but in general, all over, we underestimate that the importance of the water regulation capacity in the below glacier ecosystem mainly in its soils. A little bit of hydrology. What happens when we cultivate, when we destroy the paramo and its fragile soils? No, here below we have a discharge variation in a small paramo catchment, and two catchments, paired catchments, one conserved and one converted into agriculture. And the first thing we see is, of course, that the peak flows, we have now peak flows in the agricultural catchment, and that the conserved catchment is much better regulated. The same discharges put into order into a flow duration curve, no, from high flows, the highest flows, to the lowest flows. Here we see more clear. No, we don't have that much difference in the high flows, but we do have in the low flows, and it's a logarithmical scale. So the low flows and the dry season flows really drop dramatically when the water regulation capacity is affected by the cultivation. This is a catchment, paired catchment study in Paramo, and here to the right we have a paired catchment study further south in the similar ecosystem of the Puna. The overall water yield or runoff ratio also drops, not that dramatically, but also drops. So we have a drop in water yield, but mainly we have a drop in water regulation capacity. This is to the east of Quito, with the highest active volcano in the world there, Mount Cotopaxi. And this is one of the catchments that, this catchment actually provides about 25% of the water for the city of Quito, and where we have one of the most important dynamics of agricultural frontier climbing up. No, also reached directly to the Paramo. No forest, intermediate forest less. The agriculture is not deforesting; it's going directly into the Paramo already. The intake for the water company is about here. So today we have agriculture upstream the intake. No, where before we had only natural Paramo area in this. Catchment. Same thing here on the map. This is an analysis of to see where we have the city of Quito here, long and narrow, no, in this inter-Andean valley, and mainly the eastern Cordillera, eastern mountain range. How agriculture has advanced into the yellow areas, which is the natural Paramo. In the last. In here depicted the changes in conversion from Paramo to agriculture in the last 8 years, you know, in a span from 2014 to 2022. So it's a general, in a certain altitude range, a general advance of agriculture into the Paramo. Therefore, a conflict between agriculture and the water and the source water areas. What can we do about this? No, so Quito, as I said in the introduction, we have this waterfront in Quito. It's actually the very first waterfront in the world, already more than 20 years old. And what are our strategies, no, to do about this? We have own water reserves in certain critical areas, but our main tool is conservation agreements. So we try to establish conservation agreements with private and community landowners. We do have both types of land ownerships. No, there is indigenous community land, and there is also private land, large and small, in the areas around Quito. So with all of them, we try to establish agreements in which we look for win-win situations. Win as the water source and win as the owner. No, so restricting certain activities that are that mostly affect the source water function. Such, for example, such as reduction or elimination of livestock in the highest areas. No, concentrating livestock in lower areas where they can be better managed, and they are less, and then the affection to the water sources is less. It can also be a conversion on other activities. For example, where there is a touristic potential, we have several cases of conversion of livestock farming or larger scale agriculture towards ecotourism. No, where agriculture is necessary for the livelihoods, of course, it's the case in many places. No, we try to support farming with less use of chemicals, less fertilization, etc., in order to and restrict it also to certain zones, no, in the landscape, for example, farther away from streams, no, so that we minimize the impact on the water sources. Where we have a chance, and according to the land ownership, we also restore degraded and historically overgrazed paramos, no, active restoration or passive restoration, just eliminating all of the threats, no. This, of course, goes only when we have a good support in both the urban and the rural population, no, true. And so we work in raising awareness about the importance of water source ecosystem. And we also provide a lot of information with hydrometeorological monitoring and social and environmental information that's relevant for our decision making, but also for the decision making of other entities in the integrated water resources management sphere. No? So just the final message, this is really so important for the society in the high Andes, both urban and rural, that we can find the adequate equilibriums in this nexus, in this conflict. No, it's absolutely essential for the quality of life. If we keep destroying our water sources, this with the impact on cities and water users in the rural areas, also on hydropower and other water users, no, irrigation will be extremely important, and regrettably will be not reversible. No, so really something to be on the agendas in this kind of context. I thank you very much for your attention, and success to the other speakers, and also ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Bert, for the very enlightening presentation. And please continue to put your questions in the chat box, preferably in the Q&A function of Zoom. Let me introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Boris Ochoa Tocachi, who is the CEO of UTAC Consultoria Estratégica, and also the founder of the Institute for Applied Sustainability Research in Ecuador, and senior advisor for forest trends in the Natural Infrastructure for Food Security project in Peru. Boris has developed his professional and academic expertise around mountain hydrology, hydrological monitoring, and ecosystem service management. He holds a PhD in hydrology and also a master in hydrology and water resource management from the Imperial College of London in the UK, and a civil engineer degree from the University of Cuenca in Ecuador. Please, Boris, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Steph, and thank you to the organizers for this webinar. Also, I want to thank Bert because he helped a lot with the content that I'm going to show. I think we had a very great introduction about the paramo ecosystems, because that is one of the most important ecosystems in the Andes. I want to just expand a little bit the view on the Andes in general, and talk about water security here. So if you look at this map, you would see how precipitation changes throughout the year in the Andes. And as you can see, we have probably one of the wettest places on Earth here in the Chocó region in Colombia, northern Ecuador. But we also have one of the driest areas in the world, between the desert in northern Peru to the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. But what this means in general terms for people that live in the Andes is that we will see something like this in just a couple of months. For example, this very first picture was taken in December, sorry, and the second picture was taken in April. And as you can see, just in a few months, the landscape looks very different. So this wet season and dry season difference combined with land use changes, especially agriculture, plantations, and livestock grazing, will have huge consequences for people that live downstream from these basins. For example, flooding when we have excess water, or droughts when we don't have enough water as we should have. And mountains, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Ethiopian highlands, and many other mountains, they act as factories and sponges of water, as we used to call them. So when we refer to the factory of water, we talk about this water yield ecosystem service that mountains are providing for people that live downstream. So the amount of water that is effectively transformed from rainfall to a stream flow. And when we talk about the sponge, we refer to the hydrological regulation capacity of these basins, how long these watersheds are able to store water and then release it to the rivers that feed the communities that are located in the lowlands. So going to this point that Bert was talking about, the Paramo ecosystem that extends from northern Peru to Ecuador, throughout Colombia to Venezuela, and even to Costa Rica, is very important for the water provision of the populations that are located both in the Pacific coast, but also in the Amazon basin. But throughout the years, these ecosystems were not studied, and we were living in a position of data scarcity for a long time. It's just in the last 2 decades that we had a boom in scientific research and data generation that actually started showing all these features and benefits of the ecosystems, going from the social context to the ecological, hydrological, and ethological, and many other disciplines that started studying these ecosystems. But when we look at more generally how the Andes and the ecosystems located in the Andes have been studied, we see a huge bias in research. For example, the Puna ecosystem, that are the grasslands that are located in Peru, Bolivia, northern Argentina, and Chile, they cover 85% of the tropical Andean grasslands, but they only represent 6% of the research in these areas. And the Paramo, although very important, only covers 12% of the surface of the tropical Andean grasslands, but concentrates 92% of the research in this area. So this bias, although it is important to acknowledge how the Paramo ecosystems have been studied in the last 2 decades, and that is very positive to understand how the hydrological processes are and how this relates to the ecosystem services that we enjoy living in these areas. Still, there is a huge part of the grasslands that have not been studied as they should have. And this is also a problem when we talk about other conditions that we would like to study. For example, the restoration of those grasslands, or what are the impacts of restoring these grasslands, or what is the scale at which we are looking these processes, especially when we try to look this at the landscape scale and not only at the point scale. This is reflected, for example, in these 2 graphs that I want to show you here very quickly. When we talk about the impacts of land use, we can see that in the field, those impacts are very obvious and very visible. For example, talking about soil moisture content. When we look at the same land uses in the lab, we cannot see the impacts that we will see in the field because of all the conditions, that the heterogeneity that we will see in the mountains. But when we look at restoration, not what are the negative impacts, but what we as people could do better to restore these ecosystems, we will need to wait at least 5 years to start looking at the change, and sometimes even decades, or sometimes even centuries when we want to restore, for example, a wetland that has been disturbed. And there are many land use impacts that we will see in these mountains, especially when we talk about food production. For example, when we talk about cultivation of potatoes, like you see in the picture, when we talk about grazing, especially of different types of livestock, cattle, sheep, and many others. Or when we talk about forest plantations, because sometimes we think that planting trees is going to give us an answer for water availability. So there is an initiative that started 12 years ago that is called the Regional Initiative for Hydrological Monitoring of Andean Ecosystems, of the IMEA initiative, that started looking at all these different land use changes that were happening in these countries, from Venezuela to Chile, and having watersheds that could be similar in certain aspects from one another, from Bolivia to Ecuador to Peru to Venezuela, forming these institutional agreements between communities, decision makers, academia, and other monitoring networks to make evident those changes and to try to introduce this information and data to policy changes. This is very similar to the graph that Bert showed us before, but also including other types of ecosystems in the Andes beyond Paramo. But what we can see here is that cultivation will have a very strong effect on the low flows, as you can see here, and that is something that replicates in the different types of ecosystems that exist in the Andes. Grazing, for example, in the context of food production from livestock, won't have a huge impact on the water yield, but will have a huge impact on the hydrological regulation of those basins. And forestation, planting trees again, will have a huge impact both in water yield and also in hydrological regulation, as we will see here. They will change, planting trees will change both low flows, but also high flows. And there is sometimes this idea as well of saying, okay, land use changes are going to produce huge impacts on the landscape, but we are also facing climate change and glacier retreat. And in the last 50 years, for example, in Peru, it is reported that the country has lost 56% of the glacier extent. And sometimes we want to attribute all those negative impacts that we are looking downstream to those changes in glacier melt and glacier contribution. There is a study that was published just 5 years ago that showed that actually glacier retreat and glacier melt contribution affects especially those areas that are located very close to the glacier sources. But if we look at what is happening in that propagation of the glacier melt contribution, we look that those impacts won't necessarily be transferred all along the streams to those areas that are located in the lowlands, both in the Pacific and in the Amazon basin. And if we look at those areas that are more critical in close to Quito, in Cordillera Blanca, close to Huaraz in Peru, in Vilcanota Basin, close to Cusco or La Paz, we will see that in a normal year, let's say, talking about the climatology in general, we won't see necessarily those impacts of glacier retreat translated as we would expect, or as sometimes it is announced, especially in the news when we talk about climate change. And this is very important because when we talk about climate change, probably we need to look more at what are the impact of extreme events rather than what is the impact of glacier retreat, for example. It is also estimated that Peru has lost $10 billion in the last 3 El Niño events. And this is something that probably we need to look at more than other effects like what is the contribution of glaciers. And there are many hydrological risks that are associated to this type of extreme events. For example, we will go from different types of water erosion to the occurrence of landslides, sediment transport and deposition, and flooding especially. What we want to promote in order to control those hydrological risks is different types of interventions that are able to affect also different parts of the hydrological cycle. And this could go from, for example, some natural infrastructure interventions or nature-based solutions as they are called, for example, infiltration trenches, terraces, forestation, reforestation, water harvesting, the conservation of ecosystems and the restoration of those ecosystems that have been affected before. With the idea of transforming a basin that could be bad managed, like for example, with deforestation, without protecting the slopes, etc., to a watershed that could be well managed by the introduction of all these different natural infrastructure interventions. In the project that Forest Trends was leading in Peru, the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security, we published a series of policy briefs from looking at all these different impacts that these different types of natural infrastructure interventions would have on the ecosystem services. But I want to focus here on one specific type, which is water harvesting in the Andes. Sometimes we think about seeding and harvesting in the context of food, and that is very important, but there is also this concept of seeding and harvesting water. There are many communities in Peru that live in the Andes that are practicing this activity called amunas, that come from the Quechua word for retain, or mamanteo, that comes from the Spanish word for breastfeeding, that has this idea of seeding the water when there is an excess water during the wet season, diverting the water from the streams, letting the water infiltrate in the soils, and then recovering the water downstream in springs or lagoons that are located further, for example, a few hundred meters further downstream. We estimated that applying this methodology, for example, in one case that we studied in the Sierra of Lima in Peru, we estimated that 25% of the rainfall is transformed in a stream flow. That is a very low water yield, but the water travels very slow throughout the soil with a residence time of 45 days, which means that instead of just running over the surface in a couple of hours or days, we can actually store the water within the soils for several weeks or even months. And around 50 to 70% of the water is recovered downstream, and the rest is not water that is lost, but could actually be potentially recovered further downstream, for example, in regional aquifers that are located in other areas. What we did is created a model that could estimate what is the potential of replicating this water harvesting activity in the upstream area of the Rimac Basin that provides water to Lima. And we estimated that actually this could provide approximately 100 million cubic meters of water per year to the thirsty city located in the desert. That means that we could actually combine these green interventions or these natural infrastructure interventions with more conventional gray approaches, as they are called, for example, water transfers from the Amazon, reservoirs, dams, etc., in order to reduce those peaks in water, the flooding problem that we may have, but also increase the amount of water that we would have during the dry season. So this idea of combining green and gray interventions is actually what we promote more in the context of what we could do better to manage water and to be more effective to provide water to the cities, but also to the areas that produce, for example, agricultural areas that are located downstream. So I just want to finish giving a few key messages. We think that there is a huge potential in complementing monitoring. We need to overcome that data scarcity that I talked at the beginning, and that can be done through citizen science or other participatory approaches to monitoring in mountain systems. We need to look at interventions that are much more complex than only land use changes. For example, it's not only about how the agricultural frontier is expanding or how grazing is affecting the soils, but also this combination of different natural infrastructure interventions that will have an effect on the hydrological cycle. And there is a huge potential in combining green and gray infrastructure or green and gray projects, as I mentioned in the last example. But I think that we need to look beyond those interventions. We need to look at the source, which is how we can protect and restore the ecosystems that are actually providing the ecosystem services that we use downstream. So I think that although we may look at all these different interventions, I think it is more important to really protect, conserve, and restore those ecosystems that are the water sources for the people that live in the mountains. And we also need to
Thank you. We need to finish, Boris. We need to finish this one. Thank you.
Yeah. Don't forget that our people living there and not only the ecosystems that are located in the mountains. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Boris, for this fascinating talk and for bringing the examples all the way from traditional practices to advanced hydrological modeling. Great presentation. So now we'll move to the other part of the world, the other side of the world, to another region, to the Himalayas, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Santos, Nepal. Let me briefly introduce him. He works currently for the International Water Management Institute, or IMI, in Nepal, where he started in 2022. He is responsible for managing water resources and the climate change portfolio, and managing projects related to hydrological assessment, climate change, climate resilience, resilient water sanitation and hygiene, and also the water, energy, food, and ecosystem Nexus. Before IMI, he worked for ICIMOD as the climate and hydrology group lead, and he was responsible for designing and implementing research activities on climate change and water resources in the Himalaya region. Santos did his PhD in mountain hydrology at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena in Germany, and he holds 2 master degrees, one in environmental management and one in anthropology in natural resource management. So Santos, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Steph. Hello, everyone. I'll try to share my screen. Can you please confirm you see my right screen?
Yes, we can see it. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm from Kathmandu now. I would like to thank for this opportunity to Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute, International Potato Center in CGIAR. And I'll be sharing now from Andes to we're moving to the Himalayan region. And I'll be sharing some of our work from the large scale modeling in Indus and Ganges River Basin, and also some promising results from our initiative, CGIAR initiative called Nexus Gains. Okay, the Himalayan region, also known as the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, extends from Afghanistan in the west to the Myanmar in the east, and extends over like 3,500 kilometers and shared by 8 countries. It also hosts 10 big river systems of Asia, mostly the transboundary river basins, for example, the Indus and Ganges. And this river basin actually is inhabited by 1.9 billion people, out of which 235 million people lives in the mountains and the hills. And these mountains served as a water tower, especially for the downstream areas, downstream river basins. And some of the water towers like Indus are one of the critical water towers, one of the most vulnerable, but equally one of the most important if you compare at the global scale. And that shows the very strong upstream downstream linkages. And this area is also biodiversity hotspot. And it has a huge ice reserves, like 6,000 kilometer cube. And if you put this figure in, like, of 60 kilometer square city, something like Manhattan, you will have a tower of 100 kilometers in the atmosphere. So that's sort of ice reserve in the region. If you look at the climate change, this is the historic climate trends of the past 30 years. And you see on the left side, the temperature trend, and as you see that there is a consistent increase in temperature trend in the range of 0.2 to 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade. And in some areas, in some hotspot areas, the trend is even higher. And in case of precipitation, you see like, patterns of both increasing and decreasing. And in some areas, there is a statistically significant, as you can see in the diagonal bar here. But more importantly, the future climate change, the temperature increase is projected to be like in the between 2.5 to 5.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century on the different climate change scenarios. Even in the 1.5 degree world, the Himalayan region would be like 2.1 degree plus minus 1 degree Celsius. So the 1.5 degree is too hot for the Himalayan region. And because of this, the climatic extremes are likely to increase, which is already indicated by the IPCC with high confidence. And because of these drivers, the climate change has already affected a lot of natural resources. For example, the glaciers are shrinking. In Nepal, in the last 3 decades, 25% of the glacier area has shrunk. But in terms of climate change, under 1.5 degrees Celsius, even under 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios, the 1/3 of the glacier ice will be lost in the Himalayan region. So even if we do whatever the scenarios of climate projections, we're gonna lose 1/3 of the glacier ice. But if we go with the business as usual scenarios, then probably 2/3 of the glaciers will be gone. There is a consistent decrease in snow cover in all scenarios in the regions. The hydrological extremes will be rising. The projections are indicating that there is a seasonal shifting of discharge and meltwater. And this will affect water availability in both space and time, too much and too little water towards the end of the century. And I think in the opening remarks, it is also mentioned that the water is actually the system connector to the ecosystem, food, energy, and economic activities. As you can see here in the graph, the water resources, both in terms of availability, access, quality, and stability, is key for the different sectors like drinking water sector, wash sector, food preparations, food processing, energy, and other industrial uses. And this actually provides the stability, access, and availability, and food and nutrition security. And all these in combinations is the, for the economic prosperous and economic development. So we see a very strong interface here between the water, food security, and nutrition security. So if you look at the importance of meltwater in the basins like Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra, here you can see Indus, the meltwater contribution of both snow and glacier melt is something like more than 60–70% in the upstream tributaries of the Indus Basin. That shows the very strong dependency of the meltwater especially in the upstream regions. But if you look at the contributions of snow and glacier melt also for the irrigation water supply in the downstream areas, more than 60% in the downstream area. But if you move to the eastern region of Ganges and Brahmaputra, the relative contribution of snow and glacier melt is less. But in Indus, the 60% of the total irrigation withdrawal during the spring season originates actually from the mountain and mountain meltwater, and that actually contributes to the 11% of the total crop production. And this is very, very significant even in the downstream areas. And this is the work that we published in Nature a couple of years back. But again, if you look at the contribution of the meltwater in some of the crops like sugarcane and cotton, as you can see, the red indicates the higher contributions like 50–60%. And in certain crop growths, seasons, the contribution of meltwater is very, very important, as you can see here. But if you convert that meltwater contribution in agriculture production in Indus and Ganges, from the Indus, the upper bar, I pick the rice. So 15% of the annual 19 million tons of rice production in Indus can be attributed to the meltwater coming from glacier and snow. And similarly in the Ganges, 7% of the annual 103 million tons of sugarcane production in the Gangetic Plain actually is attributable to the snow and glacier melt. So this indicates the huge contributions of the snow and glacier melt in the food production of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So how does the future look like in terms of irrigation? So here our assessment, which we published last year in Nature Climate Change, indicates that the melt runoff shifts to 1 or 2 months earlier. As you can see here in the first graph, the meltwater peak is actually, there is an early melt peak. There is an earlier onset of high flow seasons by again 1 or 2 months, basically due to the earlier melt peak, as you can see in the middle graph. So there is like a high probability of floods during this period. So overall increase in irrigation water demand due to expansion of the irrigation areas in the future, and higher crop water demand in the warmer climate. But interestingly, the increase in the runoff actually coincides with the increase in water demand during the onset and middle of the monsoon Kharif seasons in the in Indus. This is the example from the Indus. So we look at the meltwater and groundwater scenarios in the present condition as well as the future conditions. And here we can see we picked the SSP RCP 4.5 scenarios. And I give you an example of the cotton, for example. In the reference period, the upper bar, the contributions of meltwater, which is in the range of, as you can see here, nearly 50–60% contributions in the early stage of cotton productions in June and July. But that contribution and dependency of the meltwater will be further increased in the early stage of the crop, as you can see in the warm, dry scenarios here. But most of the other scenarios, except warm, wet, it indicates that there will be more dependency on the meltwater for the crop like cotton. In the lower panel, you see the contribution of groundwater to irrigation in Indus again. And here you see, I picked the example from the wheat. There is in the reference period also, there is a dependency of the groundwater, especially towards the end of the crop calendars. But that dependency will further enhance, there will be more dependency in certain scenarios to the groundwater. So our overall assessments indicates that there will be more dependency on the meltwater in the context of the climate change, but as well as there is a more dependency on the groundwater because of the the erratic rainfalls and people, farmers will be more dependent on the groundwater. The future doesn't look promising because other than the climatic change, there are other socioeconomic changes that are also happening. Again, example from Indus, the populations will increase by 50% by 2050s. The GDP will be increased by 8-fold. Again, the temperature scenarios is already there. So there is a strong growth in population and economic development, which will demand for more fresh water and then other water, energy, food ecosystem resources. So most vulnerable and critical water towers at the global scale, the Indus will be more uncertain in the future because of these. And then, as we all know, that Indus Basin is hydropolitical tensions, considering the upstream, downstream countries, is very high. So that actually indicates that the managing the water, energy, food will be more challenging in the future. To address this, this One CGIAR initiative, Nexus Gains initiative, we are very much working on the water, energy, food ecosystem Nexus in all these basins from Asia, the Aral Sea, Indus, Ganges, and Africa, Blue Nile, and Limpopo basins. We are looking at the integrated modeling tool to assess the trade-off and synergy among the WIFI sectors. We are also looking at the water productivity across the scales. We are also very much working on the energizing food for water systems. So some of the pilots that we are working is the solar powered irrigation system here. And then we are also equally giving emphasis on how can we enhance the WIFI Nexus governance, because only talking about the biophysical and modeling probably doesn't work. And then we have a very dedicated the capacity building activities to develop the capacity of the WIFI actors from the different sectors. So we are very much looking at the basin approach and quantifying and accounting water, energy, food ecosystem resources, upstream, downstream dependencies, and synergy and trade-off. So some of the examples of these Wi-Fi Nexus from Nexus Games initiative is that looking at the web platform, the dashboard of the water productivity, as you can see here for the Ganges basins. We are also working on the multi-stakeholder platforms across the federal scales to promote the Nexus governance. We are working on the boosting water productivity through dry seeded rice-based systems in the Ganges basins. We are very much working on the gender dynamics. What are the challenges of gender dynamics in the irrigation institutions? Water storage diagnostic tools are mainstreaming the environmental flow in Nepal. I'll conclude my slide, the presentation with one slide where we are not only working on the biophysical side of tools and models, but we are equally working on developing the capacity of the emerging Wi-Fi leaders. So we have developed the sensitization course, we have developed the professional course about the water energy food ecosystem nexus. We are trying to bring these courses into the academic curriculum so that we can train the students from the very beginning of the university and college. But at the same time, we are working on the development of Wi-Fi Nexus, particularly in women leadership course, and piloting this in fashion of mentor and mentee relationship. So we have already trained nearly 20 women leaders on the water energy food ecosystem. I think these from the different sectors, from the government, academicians, and as well as the private sector and civil societies. I think these leaders are very, very important to promote these ideas, to think about managing resources in a more holistic way. I'll end here my presentations, and I would be very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nepal, and all of our speakers. We're already reached the top of the hour here, but we wanted to extend a few minutes to just field maybe a few questions. Let's see. Maybe one question, and if you could just answer very briefly so we can wrap things up. Dr. Debrive, you mentioned water agriculture and also urbanization as threats. What are the win-win examples of conservation agreements? Conservation agreements are for what type of agriculture or activities? Is it row crop, perennial crop, animal husbandry, etc.?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, win-win refers to win for the water source, so water regulation capacity is intact or can be recovered, and win for the owner, no, mostly a community land and their economical activity. No, this can be very variable. No, so it could be agriculture, could be livestock, could be tourism, could be it could be conversions between them. The win could be any conversion. No, this is a long negotiation process where we really can be flexible and identify thoroughly the socioeconomic aspects, cultural, whatever, so that we obtain a sustainable agreement, which is not a legal, strong legal figure or economical calculations. Is about the people feeling that they're winning from their point of view. No, we have several dozens of conservation agreements that like now. Sometimes it takes a few weeks to obtain of negotiation to obtain one, and sometimes it's several years and very, very difficult, and sometimes it doesn't work either. But I think it's a relatively successful tool in obtaining a better situation for everybody.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ochoa Tokachi, you mentioned the need to study the impacts of grass restoration and the need to enhance our knowledge. What about the impacts, either positive or negative, of water harvesting techniques like coaches or innovations like solar water pumps? Can you respond to that, please?
Yeah, I think we need to really invest in general in more research and data generation for all these different types of interventions. And when I say that, I don't refer only to the biophysical systems. There was actually a question about how we could also explore all the social context that comes with those interventions, because sometimes we think that extrapolating solutions or just replicating different types of infrastructure is going to solve the problems, but we need to think more holistically on how the social structures that are associated with the nature-based solutions, for example, are needed to their success. So I think we definitely need more research. There is a lot that has been done, so we are not inventing the wheel again, reinventing the wheel, and we just need to use that ancient knowledge and scientific knowledge together to find better solutions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Nepal, meltwater is important for lowland farmers. As the flow of meltwater reduces, what options are available in the Himalayas for enhanced upstream water storage?
Thank you, Randall. I think this is very important when our water storage options, especially in the mountains, the snow and glacier will be diminishing. We need to really look for the water storage options, but not only on the gray side of the water infrastructure, storage like the big dams or reservoirs, but we have to also consider the ecological based water storage options. And we have to really solve these problems across the scales. And if you really go to the village, at the farms levels, the small, the water storage options like the rainwater harvesting or soil water-based, the storage are very, very important. And especially in the Himalayan region across the east and west, the springs are drying, which is the lifeline of the mountains people. And how can we conserve the springs based on the spring set approach or watershed approach so that we can supply more reliable the options for the different form of the water storage. And I see the questions also in the, the different kind of geological risk and how do we make a sustainable decisions for our livelihoods and settlements. I think equally important also is to consider the geological risk. On top of that, there will be climatic risk, which will be more, the extreme events are happening, and we have seen a lot of disasters in the regions, whether it's a Chamoli in 2021 or the Melamchi here or the Sikkim this year. I think we are in the more disaster prone areas and we have to make decisions sustainably. So I'll end here. Thank you, Randall.
Thank you. Maybe one question for all speakers, if you could just say a few words. The webinar is about the water food nexus. Do we know what the impact of changing hydrologies will be in food production in rain-fed highland agriculture in the Andes or Himalayas? I think some of you touched on that a bit already, but if you could just fill that out a little bit more.
Maybe, Randall, I can quickly address that. What is happening in the Himalayan region is that the snowfall is decreasing very much, and then the farmers which depends on snowfall in snow storage in the winter time, now they are seeing very less amount of snow, which are actually very severely impacting the high mountain agriculture. So I think that's very, very serious. I don't know the solutions, but that's really impacting the farmers in the high mountain areas.
Thank you.
I could compliment just very shortly on, I think we can do much more with less land or with current land. As I said in my talk, we are especially worried about expanding to higher altitudes. I think that's not necessary for adequate food production in the end. We can do better on less land with better practice, so we don't have the need to expand into the higher altitudes.
Okay, thank you. Maybe
Yeah. And just to add to that point, I think we need to be very careful on what the ecosystems are able to hold. Because when we talk about agricultural practices or grazing in order to produce food, sometimes we need to look at, for example, what practices have been done for centuries that were able to sustainably use the land. For example, rotational grazing or rotational agricultural practices. But when we need to feed a larger population, when we are talking about a country scale or national scale, we need to look at what solutions we can implement in order to deal with that. And then we will have an issue of just agriculture for subsistence in the local communities against agro-industrial practices that are located downstream. So it is not easy, but I think we can find solutions that can help us all.
Okay. Thank you all. I'm watching the time here. I think maybe we can find another way to answer the remaining questions, but I think I'd like to go ahead and wrap it up. It's been a fantastic discussion today. Thank you. I wish that we had more time, but I want to share some information with you. I want to thank our panelists for your participation in this very important conversation, for sharing your expertise with us. I learned a lot. I think everybody did. And the audience, I thank you as well for your participation and for your thoughtful questions. I believe the screen is being shared right now. You can connect with any of our speakers through email and by the information on the screen right now. So again, I want to just remind you that this session was recorded and will be archived on YouTube, and you will receive a link via email when it is made available. In addition to the panelists, I'd like to thank Francis Hayes and Amber Poitras and the DWFI communications team for their support today. Viviana Infantes and the communications team at the International Potato Center, thank you. Our translator, Maria Nelly Kukuliza, thank you. And lastly, Dr. Ortiz and Dr. McCormick for your insights today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining and for considering this very important topic today. And I just want to wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.